Först och främst så fick jag droger. Det var det absolut mest centrala. Jag fick droger.
Sweden looks like one of the most beautiful places on earth. But beneath the beautiful forests, lakes, and tourist trails, there's a much darker version. For this video, I've collected some of the most disturbing cases, sightings, disappearances, legends, and unexplained stories ever. The deeper we go, the less Sweden feels like a national park, and the more it feels like something we were never meant to fully understand. A man walked down to the water at Karmansbo with a fiddle and played to it. The thing he was playing to has a different name in every part of the country. In Skåne, he's the Bakahast. Through the middle of Sweden, he's the Strömkarlen, the riverman. Further north, he's the millhouse old man. Everywhere, he's naked. He's in the water, and he plays better than you ever will. The Bakahast version is the one you tell children. A gray horse standing by the river, patient, saddled with nothing. A child climbs on, then another, and the horse's back gets longer. It keeps getting longer until every child in the village is sitting on it. Then, it walks into the water. So there were rules, and people kept them. If you heard music from the river, you did not go and look. If you had to cross the mill race after dark, you carried steel, and you pushed it into the sand on the far bank. And if you were going to swim, you threw a stone in first, and you'd throw it high so that it fell straight down and went in without splashing, and made a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle. That meant he was bound. Here's the part that sits in an actual archive. In 1934, a collector took down an account from a man in Head Parish, Västmanland, about a real local fiddler called Spell Anders. Word for word, he learned to play from a Näcken, here in Karmansbo. He went 3 Thursday evenings in a row and sat playing for the riverman. On the third night, a little old man came out with a fiddle under his arm, and he played so beautifully. You were supposed to bring a black cat without a single white hair, or 3 drops of blood from your ring finger. And you could pick out a fiddler taught this way, because he held his little finger clear of the bow. I went looking for a court record or a parish register that blames him for a real drowning. There isn't one anywhere. What there is instead is arithmetic. In 1990, Sweden drowned at a rate of 21.7 people per 100,000, around 1,100 a year in a population under 5 million, and children of 10 and under were roughly a quarter of everyone who drowned. In 1899, the new Swedish Life-Saving Society surveyed school children to find out how many could swim. 12%. Among the poorest, 9. So Näcken isn't a monster. He's a statistic with a violin. That's a country that could not teach its children to swim, telling them the water was a person instead, because a person is something you can be warned about. That's the surface. A legend doing a job. The next one is a place you can go and stand outside tonight, and no train has ever stopped there. Between Hallenbergen and Kista, on the blue line out of Stockholm, a train passes a platform in the dark. The story attached to it is the one every Swede knows, and it comes in 2 halves. The first half is a train, unpainted, bare aluminum, running at night with no destination announced, sometimes empty, sometimes carrying passengers who don't look at you. If you get on, you don't get off. The second half is where it goes. Bara de döda stiger av I Tjunglinge. Only the dead get off at Tjunglinge. There's a version of this that's a ghost train and a version that's municipal planning. And usually the truth sits somewhere between the two. Not here. Both halves are real objects, and I can give you their serial numbers. The train was called Silverpilen, the Silver Arrow. 8 cars built in Örnsköldsvik, in service from 1966 with doors that open outwards instead of sliding into the sides, which is the sort of thing that makes a train feel wrong without your knowing why. They were unpainted because the aluminum didn't need paint. That's the entire reason. 8 odd cars in a fleet of hundreds reported as an extra set at rush hour, which meant that if you saw one at all, you saw it once, in the dark, going the other way. Here's what the legend doesn't have. No first telling, no newspaper, no broadcast, no dated record of anybody saying it first. Folklorists put it in the early 80s and not one of them can produce a source. The man who collected it into the standard Swedish Book of Modern Legends said this about the train himself. I have been seated in the metallic trains innumerable times, but I'm sorry to say, nothing strange ever happened. The station is the half with the paperwork. Skymlinge was built for a new district planned on the fields north of the city, for up to 150,000 residents, with government agencies moving in. The agencies were sent elsewhere. The tunnel was already dug, so they finished the shell and stopped. The platform is there. The track is there. What was never built is the entrance, the escalators, the lifts, and the art. It has been sitting in the dark since the 70s. In March 2019, 2 teenagers were spotted inside it, and traffic control cut the power to the station, which stopped every train on the Blue Line. And the last surviving silver Pillen car now sits in a field in an open-air museum, more than 500 kilometers north of the tunnel it used to run in. So the ghost train is parked in a field, and the Station of the Dead is unfinished public works. What this story is actually about is a room that a city built for people it then decided not to send. Hold on to that. At the bottom of this video, a decision gets made about 660 people, and not one of them is ever asked. So far, nothing has happened that a planning office couldn't explain. The next one is a file the Swedish state opened, worked on for 6 months, and never closed. At about 11:45 in the morning, on the 19th of July, 1946, a farmer called Knut Lindback was working beside a lake in Norrbotten when something came down into the water. He and 2 other witnesses described an object about 2 meters long, grayish-brown, torpedo-shaped, apparently with wings, droning like an engine. It threw up a column of water, and the windows shook in the houses nearby. That summer, Sweden had about 1,000 of these. The first came in late May. On the 11th of August alone, the defense staff took over 300 reports. The final count of registered observations was 997, and more than 100 of them described something disc-shaped. A full year before an American pilot gave the world the phrase, flying saucer. The Swedish response was to form a committee. It was called the Space Projectile Committee. It included 2 astronomers from the Stockholm Observatory, and it met 12 times. Meanwhile, at the lake, an engineer lieutenant called Carl Gosta Bartol was sent to find the thing. He worked for 3 weeks. He built a raft out of 200 kilos of hemp rope and no nails, so that his own raft wouldn't set off the metal detectors he had borrowed from a mining company. He ran a Geiger counter over the water. Negative. He found a crater on the lake bed about 30 meters across, uprooted plants, disturbed sediment. He found nothing else. No fragment, no metal, no wreck, nothing at all. Bartol, afterwards. I am completely convinced that something came down in Lake Kolmjarv. Unfortunately, we never found it. Here's what the committee itself wrote down. Of the roughly 1,000 reports, 225 were assessed as observations of real physical objects, and every one of those had been seen in broad daylight. Around 30 pieces of debris were handed in and examined, and the verdict on all of them was that none of the recovered objects can come from any projectile or rocket. Slag, coke, meteorite material, farm hardware, and an 11-centimeter bolt. The draft conclusion said that without doubt, foreign experimental activity had been taking place over Sweden. That sentence did not survive into the final version, which says only that some reports cannot be dismissed. And in July, the Chief of Defense Staff sent a request to every newspaper editor in the country, given the location only as northern central, or southern Sweden. Don't print the direction of travel, and don't say whether it came down on land or in water. The reason is set out in the directive itself, and it's the part I keep coming back to. If a foreign power was running experiments over Sweden, then the easiest way for it to find out where its own weapons had landed was to read the Swedish papers. There's no cover-up at the bottom of this one. There's a folder, 12 meetings. A sentence somebody believed and then crossed out, and no answer sitting in a public archive that anyone can walk in and read. Sweden's response to a sky full of objects was to open a file. 8 years later, it's still open. From here on end, there's a document behind everything, and the first document is the one that went missing. 2 boys from Nordingra, aged 16 and 18, stood at the church door and looked at people's foreheads as they came out. They were called visgosar, pointing boys. They claimed to see the devil's mark on anyone in league with Satan, and to be the only ones who could see it. So the whole congregation was called to the service in order to be walked past them. The parish accounts for the year contain a line item. To the Nordingra boys, 20 år. I'll give you the story exactly as Sweden tells it, and then the reason almost none of it can be checked. Both halves matter. This is Torshaker in Angermanland in 1675, and it is the largest witch execution in Swedish history. 71 people, 65 women, 2 men, and 4 boys, aged 18 to 70. The 3 parishes together held 672 adults, so on any reasonable estimate, 1 woman in 5 in that valley was killed. The man who ran it was Laurentius Horneus, chaplain in Ytterlarnes, told to find witches by his parish priest. He did it by every account with great zeal. About 200 people testified against their neighbors. Most of them were children, and some were 5 years old. On the morning, the condemned were assembled at the church, where the priest gave communion, but only to the ones who had confessed. That was the moment they understood what was about to happen. Then they walked about 5 kilometers to a hill, and the ones who collapsed on the way were carried there by their own families. 3 pyres had been built, 1 for each parish. Now here's the part that changes how you read the whole thing. They were not burned alive. They were beheaded first over a block set below the pyres, and the reason is written down. It was so the blood would not stop the wood catching fire. Then their relatives took the clothes off them and lifted the bodies onto the fire. A soil survey in 1952 found the site and found evidence of 3 separate burnings. That part is confirmed. Almost nothing else is. The Commission's own trial record for Torshaker has been missing for about 300 years. What survives is 130 pages from the district court, which sentenced 60 people to death and referred 11 more upward. 60 plus 11 is where the number 71 comes from. That document confirms the leading questions, and that children sat in the room listening to each other being interrogated, and that torture was used, although it was formally forbidden. Then, it stops before sentencing. Everything else in this entry comes from one manuscript, drafted in 1741 by a man called Jans Horneus. Jans was Laurentius' grandson, and his other grandfather was the priest who started it. He is the only source for the holes in the river ice that children were lowered into on ropes. He is the only source for the bread oven with a kindling lid outside it. He's the only source for the execution dates, and the leading authority on the Swedish trial says both of those dates are impossible. No commission record, no final verdict, no list of the dead. One man wrote down the worst possible version of both sides of his own family, and that is the document. The panic itself ended the next year in Stockholm, when one of the accusers, under harder questioning, admitted she had made it up, and 10 child witnesses withdrew their testimony before noon. So the largest witch execution in Swedish history reaches us because a guilty man's grandson couldn't live with it. The court kept its record and lost it. The family kept theirs. Up to here, the record has been failing by accident. Lost, unfinished, filed and forgotten. From here down, nothing is missing at all. And that is what makes it worse. In a locked ward at Sutter Hospital in the early 90s, a patient started to remember things. Between 1994 and 2001, he was convicted of 8 murders in 6 separate trials for killings in Sweden and Norway spread across 12 years. He confessed to around 30 in total, in 3 countries going back to 1964. The patient was Sture Bergvall, born in Falun in 1950, and in 1991 he was convicted of robbery and committed to closed psychiatric care. He renamed himself Thomas Quick. Quick was his mother's maiden name. Thomas was from Thomas Blomgren, a boy who vanished in Växjö in 1964, and whom he had named as his first victim. He named himself after a child he said he had killed. The dead were real people, and they should be said out loud. Charles Zelmanovitz, 15, Pitea. Johan Asplund, 11, Sundsvall. Trine Jensen, 17, Oslo. Marinus and Jenny Stegewis, a Dutch couple in a tent at Apoheuri. Guy Storvik, 23, outside Oslo. Yanon Levi, 24, an Israeli in Dalarna. Therese Johannesson, 9, in Drammen. Here's where it stops being a murder case. No forensic evidence ever identified him. Not in one of the 8. No fingerprint, no fiber, no hair, no trace of DNA. Nothing that pointed Sture Bergvall, rather than at 4 million other Swedes. The only physical exhibit anybody ever produced was a handful of burnt fragments from a Norwegian forest, which the prosecutor called heavy evidence. The National Forensic Laboratory re-examined them in April 2010. Plastic, wood, and glue. The convictions rested entirely on what he said, and what he said was produced in therapy. The method was recovered memory, taught in Sweden by a psychotherapist named Margit Norell. She was never his therapist. She supervised the people who were, and they saw him nearly every day for 11 years. And the memory expert who advised the police testified in 5 of the 6 trials and designed the reconstructive techniques to help Bergvall retrieve his repressed memories was a professor at Stockholm University who had himself, according to the journalist who later investigated her circle, spent 11 years in weekly therapy and supervision with Margit Norell. The first time I read that, I assumed I had misunderstood the sentence. I hadn't. Through every one of those years, Bergvall was medicated with benzodiazepines, and the official inquiry says so directly. When the appeal court reopened the last convictions, it described him as heavily affected by narcotic classified medicines. In 2001, he stopped talking about any of it and said nothing for 7 years. Then in December 2008, he sat down in front of a journalist called Hannes Rastam and took all of it back. Every conviction was reopened, and the prosecutors did not fight it. In the end, they applied for the reopening themselves on his behalf. The last charge was dropped on the 31st of July 2013. Rastam never saw it. He died of cancer in January 2012 at 56, finishing the book about it. Then, Sweden did the Swedish thing and appointed a commission. It found that the investigators and the prosecutor had, in several cases, departed from the statutory principle of objectivity, that the therapist had not sufficiently considered the risk of creating false memories, and that the same handful of people had run every case for 9 years. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody was struck off. And the 8 people are still dead, and nobody has ever been convicted of killing any of them. Whoever did it got to watch someone else be found guilty of it 8 times on the evening news. 2 left. I nearly cut this next one, and not because of what happened, because of what Sweden did afterwards, which was to make it a criminal offense to go and look. And then, 26 years later, go and look. At about 5 minutes to 1 in the morning, a seaman on watch heard a metallic bang from the bow ramp and reported it to the bridge. The Estonia had left Tallinn at 7:15 the previous evening, 15 minutes late for Stockholm. 989 people, 552 of them Swedish. The waves were about 4 meters, which is a bad night and not an exceptional one, and the water was 10 degrees. About 1:20, a weak female voice came over the public address system in Estonian. Haire, haire, laival on haire. Alarm, alarm. There is alarm on the ship. The mayday went out a minute later. 3 minutes after that, a bad list to the right side. 20, 30 degrees. The last clear transmission was this. Really bad. It looks really bad here now. She was off the radar screens by about 10 to 2, 55 minutes from the first bang. The evacuation window was between 10 and 20 minutes, and most of the people aboard never got out of the interior at all. 137 survived. 852 died. 501 of them Swedish. 95 bodies were recovered. 757 people are still down there. And here's what got to me. And it isn't the ship. On the evening of the disaster, the Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt said on television that very great efforts should be made to recover the dead, and that out of consideration for the relatives, he saw that as very, very important. Notes from a government meeting the same evening record him saying the bodies shall be brought up and wreaths shall be laid on the graves. Bildt's government was on its way out. Ingvar Carlsson's took over and appointed an ethical council chaired by a former foreign minister, Karin Söder. In December, it advised against salvage, against recovering the dead, and in favor of sealing the ship. On the 15th of December 1994, the government decided exactly that and instructed the Maritime Administration to cover the wreck in a shell of concrete. 2 months later, in Tallinn, Sweden, Finland and Estonia signed an agreement. Article 3 in full. The contracting parties hereby agree that the MS Estonia shall not be raised. Article 4 requires each country to make it a crime to disturb the peace of the final place of rest. Sweden did. Fines or up to 2 years in prison. 26 years later, a documentary showed a hole in the starboard hull, 4 meters high. And the 2 men who filmed it, Henrik Evertsson and Linus Andersson, were prosecuted for it. Acquitted on the ground that Sweden cannot claim jurisdiction over open sea. Sent back by the appeal court. Convicted and the fine doubled on appeal. This May, the European Court of Human Rights asked Sweden to explain itself. But the footage worked. Sweden amended its own Estonia law to allow a survey. 45,000 photographs. The 12-ton bow ramp lifted off the seabed in the summer of 2023, and in December 2025 in Tallinn, the answer. The damage on the starboard side was caused by the seabed. The wreck is lying on a slope of rock, roughly 1.8 billion years old, and it has been moving. No trace of contact with any metal object, no trace of explosive substances. The finding from 1997 stands, and the bow visor failed. And the line that should have been the headline was this: the ship was not seaworthy. The required inspection of the bow parts had never been carried out, which made her certificate invalid. And if that had been written down properly, she would never have been on the route at all. So the answer was under the hull the whole time, and going down to photograph it was a criminal offense. It still is. This was never a conspiracy. It was a silence, legislated out of kindness, on behalf of people who had never asked for one, and Sweden had to change its own law to find out what that silence had been covering. And here's the bottom. Not an answer Sweden got wrong, an answer it got right. And the way it got that answer is what the country is still living inside every Saturday. In the most extreme group, The instruction was 24 toffees a day, between meals, every day. Vipholm Hospital opened outside Lund in 1935 to take the men the rest of the system had graded as the most difficult in the country. Out of some 13,000 people held in Swedish institutions, Vipholm took the worst rated. The official category written into the paperwork was svarskotta, obildbara, sinnesslöa, hard to manage, ineducable, feeble-minded. By the 50s, there were just over 1,000 patients. Nearly half could not communicate. More than a third were bedridden. One man decided who was ever discharged, and the same man ran the place for 27 years. His name was Hugo Froderberg. Before the experiment, there was a war. In 1939, 21 male patients died. In 1940, 23. In December 1940, the National Board of Health directed the state hospitals to cut their consumption of edible fat to 80%. In 1941, 66 men died. In 1942, 80. In 1943, 57. 203 men in 3 years, about a quarter of the male patients in the building. Officially, tuberculosis and pneumonia. The case notes show an average weight loss of almost 12 kilos before death. Froderberg wrote his own explanation down, and it survives. This is the sentence I told you about at the start, the one I wish I hadn't read, and I'm going to give it to you slowly, because a doctor wrote it about his own patients. The increase in mortality cannot be explained by nutritional deficiency, but must have its cause in biological inferiority. The board inspected that and asked for nothing further. Then, in 1945, a national dental research project was placed in Vipholm, and it was placed there because of the size. Just over 800 long-term inmates in one building, eating what they were given. Sweden had a problem. On one estimate, 99.99% of the population had tooth decay. The first phase tried to prevent it. Vitamins, minerals, fluoride tablets, 660 patients. The results were useless and were quietly played down. And here's where it stops being medicine. They inverted it, without telling the Swedish state, which had commissioned the work, and without asking one patient or one relative. The researchers stopped trying to prevent tooth decay and started trying to cause it. From June 1947, there were 7 groups. One got the base diet and nothing else. Others got margarine, or 300 grams of sugar in their drink, or sticky fresh white bread. 3 groups got sugar in their drink and sweets between meals. 22 toffees a day, or 8, or 24. The toffee was made to order by the confectionery industry, engineered to lodge on the teeth and dissolve slowly, and made deliberately too large to swallow. One description of it: a white sticky mass and tasteless. I went back and checked the delivery figures twice. 19,800 kilos of toffee, 8,000 kilos of cola, over 1,300 kilos of chocolate, about 30 tons of sweets, into one hospital. Cavities were deliberately left unfilled while patients were under observation. In May 1950, the research leader Bengt Gustafsson estimated that around 3,000 teeth needed filling and 2,000 needed pulling out. About 50 of the 660 had their teeth destroyed completely. The confectionery industry paid for a great deal of it, in money and in sweets by the ton, and then disputed the findings when they came. What ended the whole thing in 1955 was not an ethics review, it was funding. No consent, no relatives, no record of a single patient being asked. And the finding was not that sugar is bad, it was that what matters is how long it stays on the teeth, and that little and often is worse than a lot at once. So in 1957, Sweden launched a national campaign. Brush your teeth, and if you're going to eat sweets, eat them all in one go, 1 day a week. The word for it turns up in print for the first time in that same year in a temperance journal, in quotation marks, because it was new. Lördags godis, Saturday sweets. Every Swedish child born since has grown up inside the answer to that experiment. There has never been an apology. The disability movement has been asking for one for 30 years. In 2021, a member of parliament asked the Minister for Social Affairs, Lena Hallengren, directly whether she would take the initiative for an official apology from the state. She offered a meeting instead. The year after, a state secretary put the refusal on the record. It becomes problematic, he said, to pick up one dark chapter in Swedish history and apologize for it. No apology, no compensation, no inquiry with the power to compel anybody. About 560 patients lie at the Northern Cemetery in Lund, under a stone raised in 1981. And there is one more sentence, written by a Swede who went through all of this material, and I think it is the truest line in this video. Nobody knows how the patients themselves experienced it, because they were never allowed to, and could not, give testimony. Here's what I came away with. Most countries have something they did in the dark. Sweden's problems runs the other way because almost nothing in this video happened in the dark. There was a committee, there were minutes, there was a majority, and somebody stood up and explained why it was the kind thing to do. For the children who couldn't swim, for the families who shouldn't have to see the bodies, for the nation's teeth. That's the thing I keep turning over. We tell ourselves that cruelty needs somebody cruel. It doesn't. It needs a room, a mandate, a total confidence that the people it's happening to would agree if only you could ask them. That's where we're going to leave it for today. If you made it all the way down here, through the fiddler at the mill race, the platform with no stairs, the folder nobody ever closed, the grandson who wrote it all down, the man who named himself after a boy, the ramp they finally lifted off the seabed, the 30 tons of toffee, then you already know what to do. And tell me one thing in the comments. Which of these has Sweden actually settled, and which one is still open? And if I missed one, tell me that too. I read them. Every story in this video was researched and written by me. If you want the next descent, subscribe. There are more icebergs below this one. See you down there.